My family stole $50,000 to give everything to my sister, but my grandfather cut them from his will, and now I own his bakery while they're begging for forgiveness. I'm 21 years old. I just graduated from college, and I own a bakery. And yeah, I know that sounds like a success story, but the truth is, the road to get here was an absolute nightmare that I still have trouble processing. Basically, my parents stole from me. Like, they literally stole $50,000 that was mine, and they used that money to spoil my younger sister like she was a princess, while I worked myself to exhaustion just to survive. And the worst part is that for years I thought they just didn't care about me, that I was the daughter who wasn't worth it, when in reality the whole time they had my money and decided to give it to Ashley instead. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I was like 18 and had just finished high school. My parents, my mom is an accountant, and my dad is a project manager. Like, they make good money, they live comfortably, they have a nice house in a decent neighborhood. You know, they're not rich, but they're not struggling either. So, when it came time to talk about college, I assumed there would be some kind of support. I don't know, something. Because Ashley was like 16 at the time, and they were always talking about how they were going to send her to the best university when her turn came. But when I sat down with them to talk about my plans, my mom told me very casually, "Oh, well, you're going to have to look for scholarships or work because we can't help you with that." And I was like, "What?" Literally like that, with my mouth open, because it didn't make sense. I asked them why they couldn't help me even a little bit. And my dad just said they needed to save for the future, for emergencies, for Ashley's college, eventually, and that I was already an adult and needed to learn to be independent. But wait, because it gets worse. Not only did they tell me they weren't going to help me with college, but they also informed me that if I was going to keep living in their house, I had to pay rent. Rent. To my own parents. They told me it was like $400 a month, plus a proportional share of utilities, and I was like, "Are you serious?" I was 18 years old, had just graduated, didn't even have a stable job yet, and they were already charging me to sleep in the room where I'd grown up. My mom said something about teaching me financial responsibility, about how in the real world nobody gives you anything for free, and I just nodded because what else could I do? I had nowhere to go. I had no money saved. And honestly, part of me thought that maybe they were right, that maybe I was the one being immature by expecting them to help me. So I enrolled in community college because it was the only thing I could afford. Got a full-time job at a local cafe that was like 20 minutes from the house. And basically my life became an endless cycle of waking up at 5 in the morning, working until 2 in the afternoon, going to classes until 6 or 7 at night, and then doing homework until midnight. On weekends I did extra baking gigs, because it turns out my grandpa Walter had taught me to bake since I was a kid. He had a bakery that he ran for decades before retiring, and I was always good at that. So I made cakes and cookies on commission, stuff for birthdays and events, and that extra money was what saved me so I could pay rent to my parents and buy my own school supplies and food because, oh yeah, I also had to contribute to the household groceries. And while I was living this nightmare, Ashley, my younger sister, was living like a queen. I'm not exaggerating, seriously. When she turned 16, my parents bought her a car, a 2018 Honda Civic completely paid off. Sky blue because it was her favorite color. They never bought me a car. Not even used. They didn't even offer to help me with a down payment on one. Ashley didn't have to pay rent, obviously, didn't have to work, didn't have to worry about anything. My parents paid for her phone, her clothes, outings with her friends, everything. They gave her money for the mall every weekend, like $100 or $150 like it was nothing, while I was counting pennies to buy gas to get to work. And the craziest thing is that when I asked them why Ashley was getting all this and I got nothing, they told me it was different because she was still a minor, that when I was her age they also gave me things, which was a total lie because I never had anywhere near that level of privileges. It went on like that for like 2 years. 2 years where I basically never slept well, where I was constantly stressed about money, where I watched my sister get everything while I got nothing, and my parents never showed even a little bit of empathy. Never asked me how I was doing or if I needed help. Nothing. In fact, when I'd come home after a double shift at the cafe, exhausted and starving, and find Ashley watching Netflix in the living room with takeout my parents had bought her, they'd tell me that if I wanted to eat something I could buy my own food because what was in the kitchen was for the family. Like I wasn't part of the family. Like I was just a tenant paying rent. and not their daughter. One day, I think I was like 20 years old already, almost 21. I called my grandpa Walter because I was at my breaking point, you know, that moment where you feel like you just can't anymore. I was crying on the phone, telling him everything about how I was working 2 jobs plus the baking commissions, about how I could barely afford my classes and rent, about how Ashley had everything handed to her on a silver platter while I was killing myself. And my grandpa was quiet for a long moment. Too long. And then he asked me, "Rachel, did your parents never tell you anything about the money I gave them for your college?" And I was like, "What money?" I didn't know what he was talking about. Turns out when I was 16 years old, my grandpa Walter, who was already retired and had sold his original bakery, though he later bought it back, but that's another story, gave my parents $50,000. He told me everything, how he sat down with my parents at his house, how he gave them the check, how he clearly told them that money was to make sure I could go to college without having to drown in student debt. And my parents took that money, told him yes, that they were going to save it for me, that they'd make sure I had a good education, and then never told me anything. Never. In 3 years, they never mentioned that money existed. I couldn't breathe when my grandpa told me this. Literally felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I asked him if he was sure, if maybe there was some confusion, and he told me no, that he had all the documents, that he could show me the canceled check with the date and everything. He told me he'd assumed I knew about the money. That's why he'd never mentioned it before. But now that I was telling him my situation, it was obvious something very bad had happened. He told me he was going to talk to my parents immediately, that this wasn't right, and I could only cry because it finally made sense, you know? I finally understood why my parents had been so cold, so indifferent to my struggle. It wasn't that they couldn't help me. It was that they didn't want to, and they had my money this whole time. My grandpa called my parents that same night, and the next day they summoned me to the house for a family conversation that was basically a nuclear explosion. My mom was super defensive from the start, saying they had the right to manage that money however they wanted because technically it had been given to them, not directly to me. My dad was quiet, as always, but he looked uncomfortable, like he knew they were wrong but wasn't going to contradict my mom. I asked them directly, "Where's the money? What did you do with my $50,000? And my mom, with a completely serious face, told me they had invested it in the family's future, and that much of it had been used to secure opportunities for Ashley because she had more academic potential and because the university she's going to is more expensive. Can you believe it? They basically admitted they stole my money to spoil my sister. They told me they'd bought Ashley's car with part of that money, that they'd opened a savings account for her college with another part, that they'd used more for the test prep classes Ashley was taking, which cost like $3,000. I screamed at them. I think I'd never screamed like that in my life. I told them they were thieves, that they'd been watching me struggle for years knowing perfectly well they had money that was supposed to be for me, that they'd charged me rent while using my own money to buy Ashley whatever she wanted. My mom told me I was being dramatic, that Ashley was younger and needed more support, that I was doing fine anyway, so what was the problem? I left that house that same day. I called my grandpa, told him I needed help, and he told me to pack my things and come live with him and my grandma. I did it. Put all my clothes and important stuff in 2 suitcases and a backpack. Paid my last rent. Because yes, even in the middle of all this, I felt obligated to pay what I owed. And left. My parents didn't try to stop me. Ashley was in her room with the door closed, and I just walked out that door, feeling a mixture of rage, relief, and sadness that I can't even describe properly. Living with my grandpa was like night and day compared to living with my parents. He and my grandma didn't charge me rent, let me use one of their cars when I needed it, made me food, supported me. My grandpa was furious with my parents, more furious than I'd ever seen him, and he told me he was going to fix this. And he did. He sent them a legal letter, like one of those a lawyer sends you, demanding they return the full $50,000 within 6 months, or else he was going to remove them completely from his will and possibly take legal action for misappropriation of funds designated for a minor. Because yeah, technically when he gave that money I was a minor, and my parents had a fiduciary obligation to use it for the designated purpose. My parents went into total panic. My mom called me like 10 times crying, saying I was destroying the family. How could I do this to them? That grandpa was being irrational. I didn't answer the first calls, but eventually, I picked up one and told her very clearly, "You did this to yourselves. You decided to steal my money. I'm just letting you face the consequences." She started saying it wasn't stealing, that they'd redistributed it for the good of the family, and I just hung up because I couldn't keep listening to those ridiculous justifications. But here's the part that gave me the most satisfaction of this whole nightmare. In order to pay my grandpa back, my parents had to liquidate Ashley's savings account. All of it. They had to sell the car they'd bought her. They had to cut all her allowances and extra expenses. Ashley went from being the spoiled princess to having to get a part-time job at a clothing store in the mall, having to take the bus like a normal person, having to budget her money. And yeah, part of me felt bad for her, because technically it wasn't her fault our parents were terrible. But another part of me, the part that had worked myself to exhaustion while she lived without worries, felt like there was finally some justice in the world. Ashley called me once, like 2 months after I moved in with my grandpa, and she was crying. She told me she didn't understand why everything had changed so quickly, that our parents were stressed all the time now, that she had to work, and she hated having to get up early on Saturdays for her shift. And I, honestly, didn't feel much compassion. I told her, "Welcome to the real world, Ashley. This is what I've been doing for 3 years while you were cruising around with your car and unlimited money." I explained to her about the money Grandpa had given, how our parents had used it for her instead of for me, and she went quiet. I think until that moment she didn't know. I honestly think my parents never told her where all her privileged lifestyle came from. She told me she was sorry, but I wasn't ready to forgive anything, so I just told her I had to go, and hung up. The 6 months passed, and my parents managed to gather and return the full amount to my grandpa. I don't know exactly how they did it. I think they took out a loan or something, but they returned it. And my grandpa, true to his word, that same month updated his will. My parents were completely out, zero inheritance, nothing. Everything he had, including his house, his savings, and his bakery that he'd bought back a year before all this drama, went to me. When my parents found out, my mom sent me a text message saying I had destroyed, to the family, that I was a selfish and vengeful daughter, that someday I was going to regret treating them like this. I never responded. But wait, because here's the best part of this whole story. The part that makes all the bad stuff worth it. My grandpa, when he bought back his original bakery like a year before all the drama with my parents exploded, had told me that eventually he wanted me to run it. He was already old. He was like 70 years old, and although he still had energy and loved to bake, he wanted to travel more with my grandma. He wanted to really enjoy his retirement. And he knew I had the talent and passion for baking. He'd watched me grow up baking with him. He'd seen me do those extra cake and cookie jobs to survive. So after I moved in with him, he started teaching me the business side I didn't know. Like accounting, inventory management, supplier relationships, marketing, everything. I was still in college, taking my last classes to finish my business administration degree. Because yeah, despite everything, I managed to keep studying. And I worked at the bakery when I could. It was tiring, but it was a different kind of tired. You know? It was tired with purpose, with a future. It wasn't the desperate tired of barely surviving that I'd felt for years. I graduated like 3 months ago, with my business administration degree from community college. You could never go to a big university like I'd originally planned, but honestly, I don't care anymore. And literally the week after my graduation, my grandpa Walter organized a small ceremony at the bakery. He invited employees, some regular customers, family friends, my parents obviously weren't invited, and officially announced he was passing the business to me. He gave me the keys, updated all the legal documents, made me the official owner. I cried, obviously, because it was like the perfect closure to the worst stage of my life and the beginning of something really good. My parents found out, through someone else, I think a distant cousin who was at the ceremony, and my dad called me for the first time in months. He was weird, like uncomfortable, and told me he wanted to congratulate me, that he was happy for me, that maybe we could talk and work things out. I told him I'd think about it, but the truth is, I have no intention of reconciling with them. Not now. Maybe not ever. What they did was unforgivable, not just stealing my money, but the way they treated me for years. The way they made me feel like I was a burden, like I wasn't worth anything, while they spoiled Ashley with my own money. That's not something you forget with a simple apology. Ashley also contacted me recently, sent me a long message saying she'd been thinking a lot about everything, that now that she was working and paying for her own things, she understood better how hard it had been for me, that she wanted us to be sisters again. I responded, but I told her the truth, that I needed more time, that I couldn't just act like nothing had happened. She understood, I think, or at least said she understood. She told me that when I was ready, she'd be there, and I guess that's something. Now I'm 21 years old. I own a bakery that's doing pretty well. We've increased sales by like 30% since I took control because I introduced new products and improved social media marketing. I live in a small but comfortable apartment that I pay for with my own honestly earned money, and I have an incredible relationship with my grandpa and grandma who literally saved me. My grandpa says he's proud of me, that he always knew I was going to achieve great things, and that means more to me than anything my parents could tell me now. Is it weird not to have contact with your parents at 21 years old? Yes, I guess so. Do I feel bad about it? Sometimes, in random moments. But then I remember the 3 years I spent killing myself working while they charged me rent and used my money to spoil my sister. And it passes. People ask me if I'm ever going to forgive them, and honestly, I don't know. Maybe when I'm 40 or 50 and have more perspective on all this, but right now I'm focused on my business, on building my life, on being successful not because of them but in spite of them. My grandpa and grandma went on a trip last month. They're doing the Europe tour they'd always wanted to do, and he sent me photos from Paris of him eating croissants and saying, "None of them are as good as the ones I make at the bakery." That made me laugh and cry at the same time. He saved me, literally and emotionally, and now I'm managing his legacy, his bakery that he built from scratch decades ago. And that feels good. It feels like justice. It feels like despite all the bad stuff, things ended up where they were supposed to end up.